Thanks to those of you who signed up. If you can't hear me at any point, just let me know. And for those of you way out in the wings, you're very welcome to get a little more central so that you don't get a kink in your neck trying to see the slides and see me. I have a feeling people will be straggling in, and hopefully this place will fill up a little bit more, but if it doesn't, just move in. I am trying something different that you'll see in a moment, and or I'll explain in a moment, and we'll see how it goes. So let me start by introducing myself and the thing that's different. And this is under the theme of old dogs can learn new tricks, I hope. And our energetic keynoter this morning was talking about that growth category, right, of what are you doing to make some change, to develop, to grow. And one of the things I am pretty good at is giving extemporaneous talks. I can give me 3 ideas and I can fill an hour, no problem, in my view. In my highly esteemed opinion, I can fill that hour. What I'm really not good at is giving prepared talks where I actually have a script in front of me, which I do today. And this is interesting. This will be the 5th time in my career, and I've done this well over 800 times. This will be the 5th time in my career I've given a scripted talk. So I invite your patience, but it is part of my little growth plan, and it's not that I want to do this forever. It's just something I can't do. And it just frustrates me that I can't do it. You know, last night I was watching Obama give a talk in Europe. And, you know, you watch this guy, you'd never know it was scripted. And it's scripted. And he didn't have teleprompters. But every once in a while you could just see his eyes kind of glance the page. And he talked as if he was just making stuff up, you know? It was brilliant, just brilliant. Anyway, that's where I'm headed. So bear with me. So I am Dave Redekopp, and I am the owner of the Life Role Development Group. And we do career development, we do leadership, and my context is this, and it'll set up a context for this talk. I am a dabbler, and I'm really happy to be a dabbler. Like I'm sort of a researcher, but I'm not quite a researcher. I'm sort of an academic, but not quite an academic. I'm sort of a counselor, but not really a psychologist-y type. I'm not really a teacher, but I'm fascinated by education and learning. And I'm fascinated by all these things relationship to career development, because they all tie into career development. And they're all interrelated, and most of my work is managing very diverse projects that pull these things together, either to teach practitioners in career development, or teach leaders about leadership, or to do research, or to develop programs, or consult with organizations. What this gives me, of course, is a very diverse view of things. It doesn't always give me a lot of depth, so bear with me on that as well. Sorry, one more thing, aging and various other things. You know, I'm on this medication that gives me a very dry mouth, which of course means I should drink water. But of course, being older, drinking water means I may have to call a coffee break, right? Like in the middle of this. Plus, I've had a tremor all my life, and it gets worse with age, and it gets worse with this medication. So there might be like water all over the microphone and me shortly for your amusement. So let's get to it. My background is in academic backgrounds in humanistic psychology. And I found actually almost everything in undergrad psych interesting, actually. But I studied Carl Rogers and Abe Maslow because their work really kind of spoke to me at a human level, right, about what people could be. And this idea of becoming authentic, becoming all you can be, nurturing that acorn inside of you to become an oak, not trying to be a beech tree or a cherry tree or an apple tree. These ideas really appealed to me. And the practice that went with them did as well. The idea of being congruent, right? Being true to who you are. Being empathic, displaying unconditional positive regard. These things warmed my heart. They gave me hope, right? They inspired me to be better. And I was just crushed totally when I read Maslow's journals, which were released after he died, and discovered he was a really right-wing, conservative, no-nonsense guy who believed as much in the survival of the fittest as he did in, and that, you know, unconscious Freudian forces were all at work. That bubbling aggression and utter selfishness was just around the corner. He believed this stuff. And this idea that humans were just another species of animal and that some were stronger, fitter, smarter than others, and therefore had a better chance of passing on their genetic information, was actually right up his alley. And I found this view of humanity, you know, very discouraging, very demoralizing, and actually depressing. You know, if we're just a product of evolutionary biology, and we get along just because of a bunch of unconscious forces that keep us from killing each other, where's the hope in this, right? You know, why bother? Why bother with inspiration? And the answer, as you already know, lies in the word just, you know, this idea of being just an animal. And we are a product of biology and evolution. We're not just a product of biology and evolution. We're also growing, caring, striving, creative beings that Rogers talked about and Maslow talked about, and I'm sure a whole bunch others have since, but I'm a bit dated. And I've found over the years, whether in psychology or in politics, there's this real tendency for humans, all of us, to polarize issues, to be either or about things rather than both and. And we lose sight, therefore, about information and perspectives that will actually help us kind of handle, you know, the other sides of whatever it is we're arguing about. And it's in the spirit of both and that I give this talk. I want to get to a place of both and, that it's not either or, and that's the spirit of this talk. Much of the work I'm going to talk about this morning actually just makes me grit my teeth. I don't like it at all, and kind of rebel at its reductionistic view of human behavior. You know, I believe in human dignity and all these things and free choice, but much of what I'm going to describe to you this morning fits in with something else I know absolutely with certainty. And what I know with certainty is that we often do not do what we say we will do, even when we've really, really, really meant it when we said it, right? Humans often don't do. And even when there's no external force preventing us from doing what we said we'd do, right? And that was part of the keynote this morning as well. We don't always act in our own best interest. And we can easily know that we're not acting not in our best interest while we're not acting in our best interest. This intrigues me. And so I invite you right now to think of something you told yourself that you were going to do this week that you have not done and likely will not do. And I already know all of you have something on your list, you know, one at least. I also know that most of my studies in psych and career development, whoops, told you about the shaky hand part. Sorry. Most of my studies in psych and career development, can I do two things at once? Do you know all research shows that multitasking doesn't work? So I will not multitask. Most of psychology, most of career development treats this certainty of behaving against our own best interests as a nuisance, right? As noise. As noise that interferes with, you know, our beautiful therapeutic or educational music, or they treat it as friction slowing down our otherwise efficient consulting machinery, or some sort of accident in the flow of our client traffic. And with Freud, I'm going to say there are no slips of the tongue. That all of this acting not in our own best interest comes from somewhere, and it's not an accident. And we might as well dig into it. It's a given of human existence. And with H.P. Gillette, the California-based theorist, who most clearly articulates for me the need for both and rather than either or thinking, I'm going to hang on to the belief that humans can be rational, smart, caring, and rise above biology. And at the same time, of course, realize there's lots that we don't control. So here's my plan. I'd like to describe a body of work that's getting lots of attention at the moment, behavioral economics, and give you a sense of what the field is and the kinds of things it's finding out about irrational yet predictable decision making. I'll point out right now that the field is really just cognitive psychology. It just seems to get way more funding when it calls itself behavioral economics, but it's all cognitive psychologists. And by the end of me giving you that overview, we'll all know enough to be just a little bit dangerous. And then I'd like to talk about the implications of this research in conceptual terms for us. What does predictable irrationality mean for us? How does knowing about it shape how we see our students, our clients? Where do we put these ideas and findings into our own conceptual frameworks? And I'll finish with some, hopefully, practical implications behavioral economics may have for us as educators and counselors. And my aim is to have you leave this talk with the sense of what you might want to do differently back in your home environment. And here's a spoiler alert. It won't be huge, but it will incrementally create transformation, I think. So let me give you some background. The study of behaviors and decisions that don't seem to be rational or not in our full control, this is not new, right? You know, it's not obviously sensible that Pavlov's dog should have salivated when they heard a bell, nor that a client of Freud's could have no feeling in her hand, but did in her wrist. That the superstitious behavior that Skinner describes so well, and could create in a lab, and we still see this, you know, with like the Lucky Looney at center ice of our international hockey games. You know, this idea of superstitious behavior is still prevalent, and it's easily creatable. Solomon Ash's conformity experiments, some of you will remember, you know, where experimental subjects report that a shorter line in a series of lines that are all the same length except for one, and the experimental subject says, no, they're all the same, because everybody else in the room does. Elizabeth Loftus' work, you may have heard of her, she's a memory expert, and she's worked on the fallibility of eyewitness testimony, and just showing things like where using crashed rather than bumped when describing an accident changes people's memories of the accident, changes their memories of how fast cars were going. These are all examples of research efforts examining where things go wrong in human thinking and acting. We know something else is at play, right? Besides our conscious, rational decision making. And based on or in a blog that H.P. Gillette put out a little while ago, he borrowed a metaphor that's kind of useful from Jonathan Haidt. And the metaphor is a rider on the back of an elephant. And the rider says to himself or herself, you know, I can direct things, but only when the elephant doesn't have desires of its own, right? When the elephant really wants to do something, I'm no match for it. And that's kind of the place where all our clients and ourselves are sometimes, right? Human rationality, the rider, may be in the same position with its elephant, which is the emotional, instinctive, subconscious thought. So we've known about the issues of rational thought for a long time, and now behavioral economics is digging into this stuff in pretty methodical and very detailed ways. And as a field, it's what it's doing is kind of discovering and naming the very specific moves the elephant can be known to make so that we can start getting a better sense of that. And I'm going to give you a sample of these, give you a feel for the area of work, and then we'll come back to career development. So Daniel Kahneman is a Nobel laureate, in fact, one of only, I think, 2 psychologists ever to be a Nobel laureate. And he uses the term cognitive illusion to explain many of these effects that behavioral economists are discovering. And he does so because we can fall victim to them even when we know about them. This gets interesting, right? So let me show you this. You've all seen this, I can almost guarantee that. And you all know that these lines are exactly the same length. And yet all of you see one line as a little longer than the other, even though you all know they're the same length. That's the beauty of a cognitive illusion, is that you can know you're having the illusion while you're having it, right? And so this obviously is a visual illusion, but in the cognitive illusion, it's the same thing. You know you're not thinking straight, but you're not thinking straight, right? And that's kind of a lovely thing. So I'm going to go through some examples, give you a feel for this, and then we'll look at how it affects career development. Now keep in mind, I'm going to show you maybe 11 examples. There's dozens upon dozens that behavioral economists are identifying. So let's just blitz through these and give a feel. So anchoring. Anchoring, depending who you're reading, can be called reference dependence, or it can be called priming. And this labels how we make assessments and decisions in terms of expectations rather than absolute terms. So, you know, salespeople use this all the time, right? They display a sticker price like $899, and then having a now-only price of $499. And so, you know, you look at that and you go, oh man, I'm saving a bundle, when really the thing's worth $499 maybe, and maybe it isn't even worth that, right? It's just an anchoring effect. This is why when you go shopping, you might pay $75 for a scarf or a tie, but only after you've spent $700 for a suit. You'd never ever buy the tie or the scarf before you'd bought the $700 suit. Because you go, who would spend $75 for a tie, right? There's no anchor for it, and so you look at it more objectively. So from career development, think about this. Job seekers, and we see this in high school too, do this huge disservice to themselves by looking at jobs and looking at work that's available and then comparing those incomes to national averages. And they do so rather than looking at the income they actually need. And so they look at the national averages, and as they're sifting through occupational information, this becomes then their sorting criterion. You know, is it above the average or below the average? And then they rule out all these things that actually could really work quite well for them because they've anchored to a number arbitrarily, right, an average. Loss aversion. Owning something and losing it is a bigger emotional loss than getting that same something is perceived as a gain. Hope that made sense, right? Once you own something, it's more valuable to you than before you own it. This is called the endowment effect, because once you're endowed with it, right, the value goes up. And so, you know, a little travel mug that you wouldn't pay $1 for, once you're given it, it's probably worth $5 to you, and you won't part with it unless somebody gives you $5 for it, right? And this is a very well-known effect. And if you've ever had a garage sale in your backyard or a rummage sale, you know this feeling totally, right? Because your person's offering you $1/4 for something that you think is worth kind of close to the Mona Lisa. This is why losing a job is way more painful than getting a job is exciting. And why lateral transfers in organizations often feel like losses, even though everything stays the same, right? In terms of salary and status and all that. It feels like a loss, not because actual things are being lost, but you're endowed with the job you have, right? And it can feel that way. And so we see people meeting, change with all sorts of resistance because of this effect. Framing. Framing is an effect in which people make different decisions based on how information is presented. It's also called frame dependence, and it combines anchoring with loss aversion. So I was at a talk once where this presenter said, and he put this up here, I hope I have my slides right. Australia plans to maim or kill 250,000 people in traffic accidents in the next decade. And this was somebody who worked for the Ministry of Transportation for the Australian government. The audience was kind of shocked, especially when the speaker affirmed this wasn't a joke, this is Australian policy. And then he showed the next slide, which is Australia plans to reduce serious injury and fatal vehicle collisions by 50% in the next decade. Now, it turns out both slides say exactly the same thing. Because if they reduce injuries and fatalities by 50%, there will be 250,000 fewer, which is half of 500,000, which means they're still planning on killing and maiming 250,000. It's in writing. And yet, you look at how that's portrayed and you just get utterly, utterly different responses to it, right? And it's exactly the same information. So food labeling uses this effect, right? You know, products are labeled 90% fat-free rather than, 10% of fat. Or in, career development work, you see a student's reaction to hearing that there's a 67% chance of being rejected for a place in a training program. That's way worse news than finding out you got a 1 in 3 chance of getting in. And all of a sudden they're more motivated to go in. Hyperbolic discounting. You know what? We're going to skip this one. I'll get to it later. Because at some point your eyes will glaze over hearing about these. There's dozens of them. But let's move to sunk cost bias. This is the old adage, right? About throwing good money after bad. And we tend to look at past investments as a factor in future success, even when they're totally irrelevant, right? So a relatively worthless car, that, by the way, is my car. It is a 1992 Toyota Tercel. That's an image, actually, from Google Maps, parked in front of my house. They had the best picture of it, and it saved me from walking out of the house to take a picture. What you can see is they make duct tape in red now. And so the fender is all actually shaped with duct tape, and it's quite effective in certain light. It's not so effective in automatic car washes, it turns out. But they sell more duct tape, so I'm good. There's this idea that once we put a transmission or something into this car, that it's worth more. That we should therefore, we've sunk this money in, so we'll sink more money in. And of course, it's not. It just isn't. And career counseling clients often look at their investment in education this way. They'll say, oh yeah, I hate this program, and no, I don't want to work in the field once I graduate, but I've already put 2 years into it, I got to finish. And there's I don't know if this is true, but somebody told me once there's a Turkish proverb that says, no matter how far down the wrong road you've gone, turn around, right? And that would be the message here. Base rate neglect. People often make mistakes judging probabilities because they focus on relative change to the exclusion of absolute change. So now this is the inverse of the anchoring effect, right? There's a guy, Gerd Gigerenzer, out of Germany who studies risk, and here's his example that illustrates this. There was a third-generation birth control pill released in the UK, and it was reported by the press accurately to create 100% more blood clotting problems than the second generation of that pill. What happened was women avoided the new pill. There were 13,000 additional abortions in the UK that year. And when Gigerenzer started looking at this a little more detailed, he found the 100% increase changed the incidence of blood clotting from 1 in 7,000 cases to 2 in 7,000 cases. Still almost no risk whatsoever of blood clotting, right? But by avoiding looking at the absolutes, right, women made this very significant decision in great numbers about what their behavior would be. And we do this all the time in our field, right? We'll pay attention to a sector's growth, artificial intelligence is growing by 1,000%. Well, yeah, so the two guys need a third guy to come work with them. And they're all guys, by the way, at the moment. That doesn't say anything to your clients. And so what we, of course, have to do is look both at the referential but also at the absolute and see what's happening. So a 1% growth in the service sector gets you way more work than 1,000% growth in our artificial intelligence sector. Okay, that was not supposed to be a blank slide. Okay, there we go. You've heard all that. The planning fallacy. People are typically overconfident about their ability to get things done in the future, except for all of us in this room, of course. There's a tendency to plan as if the best case will occur, and not the likely case and not the worst case. So, seriously, raise your hand if you've never experienced this, that everything you've ever done happened on time, within budget, and to the quality you wanted, right? It's amazing. I mean, all humans are suspect of this, including Kahneman, who wrote, he is the guru in this field, and time after time after time has misplanned his own projects and knows he's going to, and tries to compensate and still screws it up, as most of us do. So in a career planning context, this can lead to a belief that one might be able to accomplish a list of goals in the future, like write a book, market a business, take a course, and then of course you end up with a repeated failure, and essentially giving up on various goals that may have been realistically achieved if somehow you had been able to overcome this effect. Crowding out. We have known for a long time that external rewards can dull or remove intrinsic motivation, ever since Harry Harlow's experiments with monkeys. You'll remember that, if you took psychology, that Harlow gave monkeys, he felt sorry for them in the lab, they're bored. He gave them these latches to play with because they loved playing with latches and he thought it would amuse them. Then at some point he decided to reward them for doing these latches successfully, figuring out how they worked. And what was fascinating was when he discontinued the reward system, they no longer liked playing with latches. So he systematically found a way to take something they were inherently interested in and make them disinterested in it. It only took a few days. This behavioral economist called crowding out. You're crowding out one motivation with another. This, by the way, is why we don't like used car salesmen, right? It's all extrinsically motivated. They don't care about us. I'll just give you that little tip that you might not have known. People whose work search focuses on pay, on bonuses, on perks, they don't recognize or may not recognize all the corrosive effects these things have on their own intrinsic desire to actually do the work in the first place. Priming. Priming is the non-numerical equivalent of anchoring. So images and language can be used to prime behavior. For example, one study showed that you give two groups of students a list of random words, and in one group you put words associated with aging, like gray, retirement, senior. And then you ask them to go to another room, and the ones who've read the old words actually get there more slowly, right? That's priming. Some of you may have heard this experiment that the Washington Post did with Joshua Bell, the violinist pictured on the slide. He's one of the world's finest violinists by a long shot. He plays a Stradivarius that's worth bazillions if it can be priced at all. And they asked him to play in a subway station in Washington for 45 minutes. And 1,097 people walked by one of the best violinists in the world playing one of the best violins ever built. And almost none stopped to listen. And the few who listened at all, and we're talking very low double digits, threw some money into the hat, $32. $32 to listen to the best violinist in the world play the best violin in the world. Now, my wife and I, we actually paid, I think, over $300 quite happily to see Joshua Bell in a different environment. And when you go to it's the same violinist, it's the same violin, but the whole context of being in a concert hall, of having to dress up, of having to get ready for it, and all these sorts of things completely changes the experience. And we can prime clients in all sorts of ways, right? And you know, what kind of posters you have on your wall in your counseling office, and are they showing, you know, happy, successful people, or again, it's not so much a matter of what are they showing. Are you thinking about what these posters and what these colors and what these images are priming your clients for? And is it helping them be more confident in your services or less confident? All right. I'm going to do this one really quick. Focusing illusion is this. If anything you're focusing on is more important than when you're not focusing on it. Okay, so you know, when you think, hey, you know, maybe I should get myself a new car, all of a sudden cars are super important in your life. And then once you start narrowing down your cars, all of a sudden certain features that actually you barely pay any attention to are just mind-consuming. You know, do I really need lumbar support? Well, clearly, and who makes the best lumbar support? And all these things you can put all this time and energy into that really, at the end of the day, isn't that important. We use our cars 4% of the time we own them. 4%. And yet, you know, you can feel consumed. You see this in your own clients sometimes. Well, not sometimes, a lot, right? Where the employment becomes their whole identity, right? If they're not employed, they're nobody, they're useless, et cetera. If they don't get the promotion that they think maybe they're going to get, work isn't worth doing, the company's terrible, all these sorts of things, because they start focusing on something that's becomes super important. I'll tell you about why the kitten's there later. Okay, so there's way more effects than this, all right? I'm just trying to give you a feel for what these people study. And there's no coherent theory that pulls all this together, right? These guys and gals are out there just studying effects. What they tend to rely on is evolutionary biology. Most of their explanations are somehow evolutionarily thinking this way helps us out. But it's not terribly convincing. So Daniel Kahneman talks about two systems as a way of thinking about this. System one is that automatic, quick system that guides most of our decisions most of the day, right? You know, at this conference, somebody's going to come up to you and say, hi, I'm Dave. And you're not going to stop and think, gee, should I shake their hand? Yeah, should I use my right or my left? What is the convention here? Right? You're not going to do that. It's just automatic, hand comes out, you shake their hand. System two is when you start thinking. And this is when you start thinking about what are the options, and this is where you get that feeling of agency, of choice, of concentration. So system one, you shake hands. System two happens to me all the time in Quebec, because every time I meet somebody at a conference in Quebec, I have to go through this, right? Do I shake their hand, or do I do the kiss on the cheek thing? And if I do the kiss on the cheek thing, does it go left, right, left? Or does it go right, left, right? Or does it just go left and right? When do you do two and when do you do three? Now, a colleague of mine, Serena Hawkins, actually ended up biting somebody's nose having this conversation with herself. And she will tell you about it. It's hilarious, right? Because this is what happens. System two kicks in because you've got this new environment. And system two isn't always terribly effective, right? All right. So we've got these two systems, and they kind of fight against each other. Most of our day is system one. The phone rings, you answer it, those sorts of things. Where it gets interesting is we know that we can outsmart ourselves. Right? We know we can outsmart ourselves, raising the question, of course, which self is the real self, right? The one doing the outsmarting or the one being outsmarted. But we can outsmart ourselves using system two strategies. And like restaurants, I haven't seen any that I go to yet, but apparently some restaurants, you know, when you book your reservation online, you can have a decline bread at the table button that you click. Because you know, when you're being rational about it and you've just had breakfast and you're making a reservation, it's pretty easy to say, I shouldn't eat so many carbs. Click. But when you're at the restaurant, you've already got a beer in your hand, you're chatting away with the friends, and the waiter comes by with bread, you always say yes, thinking, I just won't eat all of it. And in my case, you're always incorrect, right? So we can override things, but we got to kind of get strategic about how we override System 1. And it requires some strategy. So let's get to how this applies to career development decision making. If you believe the primary task of career development is occupational choice, making big decisions, those big, huge decisions, and other long-term significant, what I call macro decisions, you can likely ignore everything behavioral economists are doing, likely. Because the macro career development, the big decisions are almost always under the purview of System 2, right? What should I do with my life? That's a conceptual question, so you're going to think about it. There's no habit to react with. But if you believe, which I do, that every decision is a career decision, then System 1 decisions actually play this enormous role in individual career development. I don't have time to explain every decision's a career decision, but trust me on that one for now, or at least humor me for the rest of the talk. So the idea of career development as a lifelong process, a process of learning and of experience and of making choices that transcends one's work role, and that idea has been expressed in all sorts of ways. If you take Canada's Blueprint for Life Work Designs, here's a definition. When intentional, career development is about actively creating the life one wants to live and the work one wants to do. So this means if I want to be healthy and I want to be fit in my preferred future, what I ate for breakfast today matters, right? It affects my movement towards that choice. How I stand while I'm delivering this talk and my posture matters. How much coffee I drink today, those are all career decisions because they all affect my ability to become healthy and fit as I get older. So let me make some distinctions, though, that'll help out. I use macro to label those big decisions. Should I go to university? Should I not go to university? Should I have a child, not have a child? Buy a house, not buy a house? Things where there's fairly big commitment, and things for which there aren't many in life, actually. I use micro to make all the decisions we make within the macro. So once I've decided to go to university, there's a big leap, right? But now I got to decide all my courses, I got to decide my programs, those sorts of things. Those I call micro decisions. Then nano decisions. And nano decisions for me are those, minute to minute, hour by hour, day to day things that actually end up shaping us. And we make these 100 times a day, right? Who are we going to have lunch with? Who do we talk with at a coffee break? You're going to be making a whole bunch of nano decisions as soon as I'm done, right? About coffee and who to talk to and who to sit with, et cetera. What to wear to work, that's a nano decision. And so System 1, drives most of our day-to-day, minute-to-minute decisions that all do end up adding up to become our lives. This is what our lives are, is all those little decisions, right, that add up. So you make it a System 2 decision to go to university, for example, macro. Then you stay typically pretty deliberate about this System 2 decision, this macro decision, as you relate to your micro decisions now, which are, well, what courses should I take, right? But even then, System 1, that automatic system can play a role here, and I'll give you my daughter as an example. She often selects courses based on their availability, right? And which makes sense. If they're not available, you're not choosing them. But the relative success or endeavor of her getting her degree, objectively, subjectively, and emotionally, depends predominantly on thousands of nano decisions, almost all of which are made by System 1. So here are the nanos that she goes through. Do I sleep or go to class, right? Do I study with the show on in the background on Netflix, or do I study quietly? Do I go to bed early the day before an exam, or do I have one more beer with friends? Do I pay attention in class, or do I scan Facebook on my tablet? These are all those little nano decisions that feed the next set of System 2 choices. So even though your next choices are System 2, they're very rational, they've all been informed by all these irrational things you were doing. So our daughter, in my highly esteemed view, doesn't always make the best nano choices, right? And that's part of the prerogative of being a university student, I suppose. So what happens, though, is then she ends up making micro decisions that aren't in her favor, because she's made all the bad nano decisions. Now when she finally gets around to making the micro decision of which courses to take, they're all gone, right? Because she didn't get to it fast enough. So she's been very thoughtful about which courses, but none of them are available. So all that thoughtfulness is now gone. So she takes the courses she can. And guess what? They're usually taught by the weaker professors in the subjects that are less interesting. So then she goes and takes them. Oh, and at the worst time of day, she goes and takes them, and rather than thinking, boy, this sucks because it's a bad time of day and the professor's lousy, she goes, this subject sucks, right? And I suck at it. And you go, that's an interesting conclusion, isn't it? But that is her experience, right? The subject matter sucks and I suck at it. And it's all because these nano decisions led to the inability to make a good micro decision, right? So they end up creating these labels. So another premise. To add to every decision is a career decision. No decision is really a decision. No, I'll come back to that. No decision is really a decision until it's enacted. Now that may not be true, but it's a very helpful thing to think about, okay? So even if our clients in our counseling sessions make these great decisions, it actually doesn't matter till they leave our counseling session and do something, right? It's all irrelevant. It's all hypothetical. So, you know, we do all this work, and it's only when the conversation ends that decisions can actually be made. And this, I think, is where we run into all sorts of trouble. Because, and I'm going to skip a bit, our clients then end up subject to all sorts of system 1 effects, all these things that will put them back in habit, and we think we're brilliant because we've helped them make all these great choices. But none of the choices get enacted, right? And then they come back, and then we either call our client lazy or weak or unmotivated or whatever, or hopefully now we start thinking, how do we do things differently here? And this is where I want to get into implications of where does this stuff actually help us out? Because I think it can. And I've got some questions to ponder, and that's it. I don't have answers. I just got things to ponder for you, for the coffee break, for lunch, for dinner, and tomorrow, is how do we connect these two things? And I think one of the first questions we have to ask is how much of our work is predicated on the basis that our clients are rational decision makers? And certainly if you look at career development theory across the Western world, it's almost all based on the fact that our clients are rational decision makers. Gillette being the exception, who's very explicit about, no, we're not. No, we're not. We're really not. You know, when you're doing counseling, are you thinking that your clients are going to do what they say? Right? And at one level, that's absurd. And yet, the vast majority of our practice is based on that assumption, right? And the vast majority of our thinking. The other piece of this is, what's the real aim of our work, right? Are we just trying to make people, thank you. That was subtle, Kristen. Are we just trying to make people happy, right? So that, you know, we get a good tick box on our evaluation form. Or are we actually, you know, trying to help them really gain control of their lives? And this gets kind of interesting, because if you do behavioral economics right, you can actually find ways to have your clients leave very happy, very motivated, give you great evaluations, and not change a bit, right? Because there's so many ways we can actually manipulate their system 1 thinking and their system 1 action, or make use of it. You know, by priming, by framing, by doing all these things. One of the things we know, for example, is if you want good evaluations of your counseling, wait 6 months, right? Because as Dan Gilbert puts it, if tomorrow you 2 people, one wins the lottery, the other one gets their legs amputated, the next day their happiness levels will be very different. A year out, no different at all, right? Humans are built to rationalize their own experience. and we have a happiness metabolism. So the longer you wait to ask about counseling, the more successful you'll be, right? There's a strategy. To what degree is the self a cognitive illusion? We're all talking about the authentic self and the real self and all that. Maybe there isn't one, folks, right? Maybe that's just a little cognitive illusion that allows us to get by and allows us to go through life and think that we have some continuity. And if that's the case, that gets kind of interesting. It gets difficult conceptually, but it's interesting. So some policy questions. To what degree should career development policy and practice include trying to disrupt people's system one choices or nudge? I don't know if you pay attention to the nudging units in government, but most of Western European countries now and North America have what are called nudging units, and they are units inside government consisting of behavioral economists who try and figure out how to shape the population's behavior. And this can be enormously useful, right? So Germany, I think it is, or Austria, their nudging unit has this situation where if you do not want to be an organ donor, you have to be explicit about it. And they have a 99% sign-up rate for organ donors. In Germany, you have to actively ask to be an organ donor. They have a 12% sign-up rate, right? So you have nudging units that can actually shape how people make decisions. Now, their argument and the ethics of this is around we're helping people make decisions that in independent surveys we know rationally they want to make. They just never get around to it. That's their argument, but it becomes a big ethical thing, right? So, for example, in our field, right? And you'll see this, anybody from Alice here, the Alice website? Okay, think about your stuff, right? When somebody does a search on occupations, right? Do you want them to see oil-based things first, or now that oil's kind of passé, do you want them to see greenhouse or green occupations first? That simple little thing shapes how people will make decisions. Where it goes on a screen shapes how people make decisions. And I can't remember left, right, or center, but there is one place on a screen where you will almost never get a choice, unless it's absolutely the only choice that's reasonable. People defer, it's either to the center or the right, I can't remember which one. You can look it up. But how we structure information choices makes a big difference. All right. Now, and the thing is, of course, the economists would argue you cannot not nudge. We're all nudging everybody all the time. You might as well do it thoughtfully, right? That is the ethical question. So on the practice front, how do we build system one change into our practice? Most of what we do, trying to help people overcome their system one tendencies, is do what our guest speaker this morning did, is we exhort them to. Right? We try and persuade, we try and convince, we try and tell them, this is really good for you, believe us. It's an instructional approach. And it actually doesn't work. It actually doesn't work. Even Kahneman, with all his graduate students who study this stuff for a living, he's actually been able to test his graduate students' abilities on overcoming their own system one tendencies. No, it doesn't make a difference. So just thinking about it, might make a little bit, but substantively no. So then you ask yourself as a practitioner, what are you doing to overcome your client's system one? And the answer you come up with is, how many people would call themselves a coach rather than a counselor in this room? Right? Coaches have figured this out. Because coaches will say to a client, you're going to do this and this and this, right? And they go, yes. And then the coach goes internally, you're a liar. And what they do is they phone and they text and they pester and they bug that person till the person gets the thing done. And this is accommodating system one in practice. Now, but there's risks with that, right? Because now you're creating dependency and all those sorts of things. But it kind of works. But I think it is one of the reasons that coaching has caught on big time in the last 15 years, is that it actually creates change because it actually follows through with when the decision will be enacted, not just about making the abstract decision in a system two way. Something else to ponder is, to what degree can system two override system one? And how can we teach clients to outsmart ourselves? And I just told you that most of the evidence says we can't. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try, right? That there's always kind of hope. And I realize my time is almost up, so I'm just going to give you some of the questions. To what degree does System 1 affect overall decision effects, especially at the macro level? Like, it could be my whole interest in behavioral economics is just a focusing illusion thing, and none of you should care. I just care because I've been reading about it, right? And that may be the case. And what you find when you look at the studies is when you change up these things and you deploy behavioral economics findings in practice, whether that's in an organization or whatever, you get these little tiny incremental improvements, but you get them everywhere. And they all add up to huge, huge change, right? And this is worth paying attention to. Yeah. I'll leave it to you to think about, how do you put this in practice? Even things like, you take that example of giving people words that have associations with aging in them, and you watch them walk slower. Well, as a career counselor, the opposite of that, of course, is to greet somebody with, hi, I understand you're really resourceful. I understand, that you've come here because you make effective decisions or whatever. Like, start embedding that kind of language in your practice. And again, it's one of those things that'll make a 2% change, but it also takes less than 1% of your energy, right? You start doing a whole bunch of these things, looking at the nonverbal cues. Posture, right? Get your clients to sit differently will get them to make different decisions, right? Just ask them, humor me. Stand like this for a moment. I know you feel like a dork, but we're going to do something useful in a minute after you do this. And guess what? They will make better decisions 60 seconds later. We can do these things, right? But let me come back to something, and I really will conclude because I know time's up. But I need water. And as you're thinking about this, I want to come back to my opening idea about this whole animal thing, right? Are we going to lose control of this elephant we're riding on? And that sometimes we're not our best selves, right? And it can get very discouraging thinking about this, that most of what we do is habit, most of what we do is just kind of built in, hardwired. But what inspires me to stay hopeful is, to stay in that both-and world rather than either-or is a fellow, Robert Sapolsky, and he has this call to action, which I kind of like. He's a primatologist and neuroendocrinologist who gave this talk to graduates, I think at Stanford or something. And what the talk was about is how humans and animals are different. But what he went through for about 25 minutes was how they're not. So we think humans love, animals don't, wrong. Humans have language, animals don't, wrong. Humans have empathy, animals don't, wrong. I mean, he goes through this in a very eloquent way, and he's got all these great examples. But his conclusion at the end of this little talk was that the characteristic, the defining characteristic that captures most importantly who we are is this: the less that it is possible that something can be, the more it must be. Okay? The less that it is possible that something can be, the more it must be. For example, the more we find an act completely unforgivable, that's exactly when we need to try to forgive, right? Or the more we realize that we'll never eliminate poverty is actually our call to work harder at it, right? And I invite you to start thinking about this problem of overcoming the irrational in career decision making, and consider this: the less that we think we can direct this elephant beneath us, the more important we have to try. We have to give it a shot. Thank you very much, and I will stick around for questions if you have some.